Interfaith Lancaster County. And we are here, we are here to give an update on educational funding because we believe it's an issue of racial justice. And that's important to us. That's important to us because God has made every person in his image. As Quakers were taught that there's that of God in every person. And these children are people. I'm also very grateful to be here because I know Kathy just reminded me, I was in OT with the IU, and I had Ross for many years, and I know the good work that you all have done for the children at Ross, and probably a lot of other good works I don't know about. Okay, so we say that this is an issue of racial justice. This is a definition by the Annie E. Casey Foundation. We could get a million definitions, but it's the systematic fair treatment of people that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But it's even more challenging than that. It's really an issue of structural racism. And again, this is Annie E. Casey. It's the racial bias across institutions and society, and that results in the effects on things that privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. So that's what I'm going to try to convince you today, that we're talking about an issue of systemic racism. So I think we all know that there have been decades of personal and governmental action that have resulted in the segregated housing that we all live in. And that segregated housing means that schools are segregated. That's why we have separate schools for poor kids and for rich kids. It's because of the residential segregation. And this slide has a bunch of pictures on it that relates to the decades of governmental policies and procedures that led to that segregation, starting with the New Deal, segregated public housing, the FHA and VA loans that mostly went to white people, the urban renewal that we see today, the redlining that they mention, the Levitt towns that were built all up and down the East Coast, not just in New Jersey, were all segregated. And then, of course, just the individual discrimination that happened in cities across the North. So there were many of those things that happened over years, that led us to the situation that we have today, where housing is segregated and therefore schools are segregated. So POWER Interfaith Lancaster County is a coalition of interfaith, multiracial congregations in Lancaster County working for racial justice. And we have programs, this program, we have been backing fair funding for about the last 4 years. Oh my. And we also have programs for climate justice and criminal justice. POWER started in Philadelphia, but it's spread across the state. So, education. The first thing to know about education and funding is that the federal government has very little to do with it. There are lots of wonderful federal programs that I'm sure most schools benefit from, but really, most of the funding is from state and local sources. And yet, the Department of Education says their purpose is to foster educational excellence and equal access. So, Pennsylvania. The main thing to know about Pennsylvania funding is that we rely on local property taxes to fund our schools. It varies over the years. Last year it was about 37% from the state. This year, for some reason, it's 34% from the state. Most of our funding comes from property taxes. Now, that did not used to be. Pennsylvania used to provide 50% of the funding for local schools. but that's been changed. And Pennsylvania is relatively unusual in this regard. We are 6th worst in the nation for the amount of money from the state that goes to local school districts. And it's even worse for poor school districts. The states on the right are the states that provide more money to poor districts to make up for the fact that property taxes are low. The states on the left are the one that actually provide more money to rich school districts. In 2015, when this study was done, Pennsylvania was worst in the nation. The good news is we are no longer dead last, but we're down at the bottom. And before we even start, I want to get one thing out of the way. I know you have heard, because I have heard, that money doesn't make a difference. Why throw more money to these failing school districts? They'll only waste it, which I think has some underlying tinges to it. But I have heard this, and I'm sure that many of your friends believe this. Well, the good thing is the United States has done what the scientists call a natural experiment that proves this wrong. Over the last 50 years, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, 28 states have been sued because they have not been providing enough money for their poor districts. And we now have some results from those states. We can compare what's happening now to what happened before, or what's happening to them to what's happening in other states. And for all of them, they've seen an increase in graduation rates for those schools, those states that now provide more money to their poorer school districts. And the one I want you to pay, well, there was a big study that was done over the whole nation to show the difference, and what they found was increase in graduation rates, increase in long-term outcomes like the income of graduates, and the lowered incidence of poverty as an adult. Things like that, long-term. Test scores, not so much, but the long-term outcomes of spending more money have an effect on people's lives, poor people's lives. But the one I want you to pay the most attention to is New Jersey, because New Jersey was sued over a period of 30 years, 10 different lawsuits, because they would win and the legislature wouldn't do very much. So then they would bring the legislature back to court, and then they would win, and then the legislature wouldn't do very much, so they brought them back to court. 30 years it took. But the last, it was like 2011, I think, was the last court case. And they gave to the 30 poorest districts a bunch of extra money and guaranteed preschool to every 3- and 4-year-old, every single one. And in 2018, there was a study done about the difference between those districts now and the districts before, and those districts now and other districts. And what they found was 20% of the gap between rich and poor districts disappeared. Now, obviously you're going to say 20%, that's not much. But at the same time, the gap between poor and rich districts in Pennsylvania increased. So if we do nothing, it will get worse. So for most of the recent period, Pennsylvania has not had any kind of formula that said, okay, if a district has this, we'll give them that, or whatever, based on any kind of decision made prior to the budget discussion. But in 2015, the legislature finally decided that, well, maybe we should do something about that fact. And they had a commission, took a whole year, and they came up with what we now call the fair funding formula. But what they decided to do was Well, let me not get ahead of myself. The fair funding formula was then passed with overwhelming bipartisan support in our legislature. I think like 2 people voted against it, literally. Okay, so what is the fair funding formula? It says, of the 500 school districts, we will distribute the money this way. First, we will count the number of students. What a good idea, huh? We will actually see how many students in each district. The poverty of those school districts, of those school students, the poverty of the district, and concentrated poverty. The amount of concentrated poverty makes a difference. The local taxing capacity, how much is the district actually trying to tax? The number of English language learners, because they take more teachers. And a correction for the sparsity of population to help rural districts. So this was terrific. It was passed overwhelmingly. However, as a compromise to get it passed, they did not apply it to the budget, only to any new money that's voted year by year. So what that means is every school district will get what they got in 2014-15 forever. We will never get to 100% fair funding with the law as it stands today. So this is the graph that tells the story. Each of these dots represents one of our 500 school districts. The vertical axis is the amount of money they actually received in 2019-20, which also means 2021 because it was the same budget. And the horizontal axis is how much they would have received if we had 100% fair funding. So if we had 100% fair funding, all the districts would be lined up along that diagonal fair funding line. You can see that they're not. The yellow dots are the 250 districts with the most white students, and you can see the majority of them are above the line, getting more than the fair funding formula says they should. The brown dots are the 250 districts with the least white students, and a majority are below the line, getting less than the fair funding formula says they should. And this one shows it even more clearly. If you divide the 500 school districts into 5 groups, about 100 each one, the bar on the right is the 100 school districts that have 90% white students, 90 or above. And they are, on the average, getting $2,000 more per student than the fair funding formula would say they should. The bar on the left is the 100 districts with less than 30% white students, and they are, on the average, getting $2,000 less than the fair funding formula says they should. And it's a linear relationship. As you go up, and the whiter the students, the more money. Interestingly, it's not the same case for poverty. It is true, the bar on the right are the poorest districts, and they are receiving less than the fair funding formula says they should. But the bar on the left is the richest districts, and they are getting about what they should from the state. Now, obviously, they're making that up by having their local taxes come in on top of it so that those districts end up getting more money overall. But from the state, they're getting about what they should. So, education funding in PA, that's why I say it's structural racism. The districts that are most consistently underfunded in Pennsylvania are the ones with the highest percentage students of color. So there's 2 ways to look at what this means money-wise, and it gets a little complicated. The first way is, in 2007, the legislature did a study called a costing out study to see how much it would cost to educate every child up to state standards. And in 2008, they passed an actual law saying that the state of Pennsylvania would aim at those adequacy standards. That it is in the law that the state of Pennsylvania must try to meet those adequacy standards. Well, then the financial crisis happened and they forgot about that law, but it is still on the books. And so, a recent study from Penn State redid that study using their same numbers, but just 2020 dollar figures, and came up with the fact that the state of Pennsylvania is actually missing $4.6 billion. We're short that much. And let's say Columbia School District is missing $5,000 per student. Lancaster is missing $4,500 per student. That's according to this costing out study. The other way to look at it, the one that I usually think about, is what if the fair funding formula had passed in 2016 for 100%? Then over the years, School District of Lancaster would have had $203 million. This year, by this year, it'd be $217 million. That is a lot of guidance counselors, a lot of preschool teachers, a lot of school buses. That is a lot of things that we could have had. So Governor Wolf has increased the education budget little by little in his time of office. And this year, he introduced a plan, he proposed a plan, he can't introduce bills, that would increase funding for education for all school districts and would put most of it through the fair funding formula. And actually, the House Republican leaders were okay with it, but the Senate Republican leaders were not. So it didn't go through. But he's promised to reintroduce it this year. So we shall see if that happens. Okay, and 2014, 6 school districts, including the School District of Lancaster, and 2 statewide organizations and several parents sued the state of Pennsylvania, Department of Ed, the governor, and the legislature, saying that the state constitution says that the state of Pennsylvania will provide a thorough and efficient education for all Pennsylvania students. And so the plaintiffs are claiming that you are not doing that, and therefore school funding is unconstitutional. That is the plaintiff's first argument. Their second argument is the one that I usually talk about, and that is they are underfunding low-income districts, the equity argument. So they are making 2 arguments: adequacy, based on that study that I told you about, and equity, based on just the numbers that I've also told you about. And the trial started on Friday with opening statements. They expect it to last 6 to 10 weeks, so through the end of this year, I'm sure. And what will happen if we win is that the judge will turn to the legislature and say, General Assembly, you are not providing a thorough and efficient education for all students. Do it. So it's going to be back on them to do the right thing. So what can we do? Well, as I say, it's really up to the General Assembly. They could pass a bill tomorrow and make that lawsuit moot, irrelevant. I'm sure the lawyers would be happy to go home. They could do it tomorrow, but they haven't quite yet done it. So here's an example of a few things that I would ask you to do. Today, we have some postcards that you could send to Scott Martin, our senator, or Ryan Ahmet. He is the senator for Southern Lancaster County. I don't know where you live. And ask them to pass an education bill that provides 100% full and fair funding. You can write that postcard today. And if you write it today, I'll be happy to take them back and mail them. You could make a phone call next week. You could come to a meeting with Senator Martin. We are in the process of making appointments back in the district with a lot of different legislators, and I'm sure Doug would be happy to add you to our list of people who want to be involved. And you could take an extra postcard with you and you could give it to a friend. But there's 2 dates, too. This upcoming Wednesday, POWER Interfaith statewide is having a day of prayer for the liberation of our children on the steps of the Capitol in Harrisburg. You are cordially invited. I know it's very hard to have something in the middle of the workday. It's at 1:30, and it's very hard in a time of COVID. We are all going to be wearing masks. You know, it's a risk, I understand. But we are beseeching God to soften the hearts of the legislators and pass us a fair funding bill. That's the point of that. We're also trying to have a steady presence, an ongoing presence in Harrisburg during the month of December on Wednesdays. So our day is December the 8th. So we're going to go back. That'll be a smaller thing. It'll be just us. And basically we'll be delivering some messages to our Lancaster County reps. So don't forget, 2 days, this coming Wednesday, 1:30, Harrisburg, December 8th, 1 o'clock, or call and write our senators. The good thing about our senators is that Scott Martin is the chair of the Education Committee, and Ahmet is also on the Education Committee, so we are golden in terms of who we need to contact. And the sheets that I handed out have the names and addresses and phone numbers of everybody from Lancaster County. So if you didn't get it, you can come get it later. And if you belong to a group that I could talk to, or Doug could talk to, PTO, Kiwanis Club, Women's Book Club, anything, I'd be happy to talk to anybody. So I think you know that our kids are worth it. And yet, we also know about what the so-called achievement gap. That means that test scores, graduation rates, and discipline rates vary by class and race in this country. And in fact, our test scores on international tests do not compare well with other industrialized nations, other rich nations. But it's not a measure of our kids, it's a measure of our inequality, because the scores of white and Asian kids are pretty equivalent to that of other nations. It's the scores of Black and Latinx kids that are not. And that's what's wrong with our education system. So, what is it that our schools are missing? I don't think that you would have much difficulty coming up with the answer. It's facilities, equipment, textbooks, teachers, guidance counselors. My daughters both graduated from McCaskey, and when my younger daughter was in Buchanan, the elementary school, she told me that the locker room down in the basement, which was not used, was haunted. She would tell me that she tells me that to this day, and she's 23. But a couple of years ago, one of the teachers told me that they often saw rats down there. So I think that's what she was hearing, it wasn't a ghost. Both of my daughters went to Wheatland Middle School, and I was an OT there. And so I know every time it would rain, there would be a big bucket in the middle of the hall that all of us would have to walk around to catch the dripping from the ceiling. And every winter, the heating system was dicey enough that they always had to worry about fire. And one year there was a fire that destroyed the art room. Luckily it didn't spread. It was on the weekend. when I went to McCaskey to volunteer, I met a junior who had come to McCaskey, who had come to Lancaster as a 5-year-old, speaking no English. And he was pretty good by the time I met him. And so I told him I thought he should think about college. And he said, yeah, but I don't really know how to do that. I said, well, sign up for the SAT first. And he said, I don't know how to do that. And I said, well, make an appointment with your guidance counselor. And he said, who is that? He had never met that person. And not because the guidance counselor was lazy, they just have too many kids. They cannot do all that's with a kid. And 2 years later, he was killed in a drug buy gone wrong. And he was working part-time at a dollar store. So my question was, where was the guidance counselor in his 9th grade who would say, you know, this is what you need to sign up for, what are your interests, what's your needs? And the 11th grade, make sure he could shadow somebody, and in the 12th grade, make sure he was set on a career plan. They need 10 times the number of guidance counselors they have. Also, we have an issue in the school district of Lancaster in that 20% of our kids are English language learners. 20%. I was tutoring a refugee from the Congo who grew up in a UN refugee camp. So she was not prepared. When she came to McCaskey at 15, she was just not prepared. So she kept failing algebra. And then she finally passed that, and she was currently failing plane geometry. And then her family, both of her parents work at Urban Outfitters. They had saved enough money to buy a house in East Petersburg. So now she's at Hempfield. She has a geometry class. They made her take it again because obviously she failed it. But her class doesn't have 30 kids. 20% are non-English speaking. Her class has 6 kids and 2 teachers. And guess what? She learned plane geometry, and she got a better sense of sort of number sense, you know, like the relationship of 5 and 10 and 2 and 4 that she had missed in the refugee camp, just missed. It takes attention. It takes time. It takes people. I have a friend who told me that her son, who also went to Buchanan, sat next to, in the 4th grade, sat next to a girl from Puerto Rico who spoke no English and translated for her all day long, this 4th grader. And he didn't do that great a job. He was in the 4th grade. It should have been an ESL teacher in the room, which they know. I've been to meetings at SDOL for Twyla, the girls' older brothers, and the vice president said, we should have an ESL teacher in every one of the history classes, the science classes, and the math classes, but we just don't have that many teachers. We don't have the money. So we're left with our moral imperative. We're taught to love our neighbors as ourselves. These kids are our neighbors. They are literally our neighbors right here. They literally live right here. If we do nothing, it will get worse. But there's things we can do. So I appreciate the time and your attention. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Yeah? Oh yeah, she says McCaskey has a good program for gifted students. Well, they have actually a lousy program for gifted students. They used to have a good program, and they had to cut it back. There used to be, at Buchanan, when my kids were there, the gifted teacher you had to test. You have to have a 130 IQ to be in the program. And so she would teach those kids once a day for math or something, but she would also invite other kids recommended by their teachers as being very curious. That's how my daughter got in. And so they got the opportunity of a really rigorous class every year, and she would have a rotating number. The question was, why have that program for gifted students and not have a program for students who need it? Yeah, okay, I was going to get there. They do have an IB program, which is not, you don't have to have the 130 IQ. You have to basically just ask to try it and be recommended by a teacher, and they pretty much take whoever thinks they can do it. They have a lot of programs for needy students too. They just don't have enough. They don't have enough to have enough. You know? I don't know. Yes?
With the lawsuit that you have to the state, and let's say you're successful, and the judge tells the legislature they have to do this, and they don't do it.
Right. Okay, what happens if the lawsuit is successful and the judge tells the legislature to provide decent funding, but then the legislature doesn't do it? Then we would have to take them back. This is what I think is going to happen. I think we're going to win, and the legislature is going to immediately appeal to the state Supreme Court, which will take another year. So I think we're really going to be looking at a year from now at the state Supreme Court, and I think we'll win again, and then they'll probably do something. Well, that is exactly what happened in New Jersey. And it took them 10 lawsuits and 30 years, but they got it. I'm hoping that the lesson of New Jersey would be enough to say maybe it'll only be 15 years, 5 years. I mean, Senator Boscola has had a bill 4 years ago for a 4-year phase-in for fair funding. Had that bill passed, we'd have it today. So a phase-in would be fine. Yeah.
We meet with a local legislator, and he is not in favor of fair funding bill that's there. What are his arguments against it, and sort of why not?
That's a really good question. She said, what are the arguments that we would likely hear if we go to the legislatures? The first argument is going to be, if we're arguing for the lawsuit, which is asking for adequacy and equity. For the last 4 years, I've been just arguing for equity. And the argument that I've gotten back is that's not fair to the school districts, the richer school districts that would basically not gain any money from this. And our answer to that is, well, then pass a little increase and give them some money. Or they can always raise their local taxes and make up for the difference. It's been a tough argument. So now that we're arguing for both adequacy and equity, the big argument is going to be what I said. Money doesn't matter. Why should we send more money to those people in Philadelphia who just waste it? And Pennsylvania already is the 6th highest in the nation in the amount of money going to schools. And that part is true, but most of it comes from local property taxes. I mean, Philadelphia, Reading, York, Lancaster cannot afford to raise taxes. We cannot. So we're not getting the 6th highest in the nation. It's just because they make it up with local taxes in the richer districts. It's a tough argument. When Governor Wolf proposed that budget, that would be an increase, he proposed a tax increase. And that was shot down so quick that, you probably don't even remember it. This is hard in the state of Pennsylvania to say we need more taxes. If you do any reading about education internationally, we are so different from the Western European countries that they provide the money from the federal government, and they pay teachers. Teachers have to go to college and then get admitted to a teacher school and go 3 more years that the government pays for. They don't have to go into debt, but they only take the best people. They really value education, and they don't have the income. They have income gaps, achievement gaps, but they have nothing like ours. We are an outlier amongst the rich nations. So, I mean, it just depends on what your priorities are. That's a really good question, though. I mean, I think you just have to argue that these children are important. If you don't educate them, what'll happen is what happened to my daughter's peer. They just will be lost. Sir?
Yes. I was a school board member in the 80s for Lancaster. And I still remember being vivid and really angry with our legislators talking about funding then. And there was basically everybody agreed that the ESME formula at the time was fair. But what they decided was that, well, we can't take money away from anybody, so they guaranteed school districts a minimum increase, and then they capped it at a maximum increase. So when I would go and complain because I remember as a fact, Tonswick Valley was getting 103% of the formula. And the school district in Lancashire was, I think, numbers might not be right, was getting like 87%. Because we were capped at a 7% increase. And the legislators looked like, what are you complaining about? You're getting 7%. I'm complaining about because I'm leaving 13% on the table.
Right.
And I used to then argue with these legislators if I had all that money over a period of years, because they basically incrementally funded school districts. So
Yeah.
it just, and the legislator is never going to take money away from anybody.
Right.
And it sounds like they still aren't today. So it was just, it would have solved the taxing issue in the city had we gotten the funding. Like your one slide kind of showed how much money we lost now. So it's, I guess it's my skepticism of the legislature ever doing anything right. Because these people are all trying to get reelected. And if I take funding away from my home school district,
Right.
it's going to make it hard for me to get reelected.
Yeah.
And I want to make it real simple, but
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that they're not going to take money away. They'll just have an increase.
Well, that was another argument.
Yeah.
You guys, it's okay, you're making us raise taxes and be the bad guys. In the little old age home, I can't put a new Ford out in my kitchen. And it's so easy for the state to raise tax and increase the pot. But we've never really seen it. I mean, we've tried recently a little bit.
Right.
But it's still, we're so far behind, it's like, we don't have those big bucks to catch up.
The one thing we have going for us right now is the lawsuit. And not that we're going to win or not win. It's just that it brings attention to to the actual situation. I think it's really easy for a lot of people, especially a lot of white people, to just say, well, things are going pretty good, why should we change? Because they don't know. They don't know what's going on in poorer neighborhoods. They just don't know. But now they're going to know. It's going to be on WGAL. It's going to be in LNP. It's going to be, people are going to be talking about it. There's going to be letters to the editor. That's the one thing that we have going for us right now, is that it's now, the public's attention is being focused towards this issue. Doug?
Pat, maybe this summer there was a demonstration at Scott Martin's office in Strasbourg about fair funding. And he said, he came out publicly and said, I'm all for fair funding. His words say that But the thing is, they won't take the next step. They won't change it. They won't increase it. They won't do anything else. But because he supports what exists now as what is now 13% increase, he's allowed to say, I'm in favor of fair. And that's what he said. And I know some other people got in touch with him and said, well, this isn't enough just saying this. You need to do more. So that's part of the argument that you would get from Scott Martin. They've already done it, is what he says. But this is the important part, as Beth said, because the court will tell the legislature, we've got to bring this up to standard, we've got to change this. But the legislature has to go back into session. People have to introduce bills, go to committee, and all the stuff that the legislature does. And they could drag their feet, they could change it, how it works. So this is why we have to make this move now. And Beth and I were talking earlier, they do this, the offices for our senators and the legislators, they count, somebody in there keeps track of, we got 15 phone calls about this, we got letters about this, we got postcards about this, and they do look at it. It begins to make a difference to them, but it takes volumes of stuff, which is why doing the postcards today, and you saw that slide, was intended to keep after them. And I would encourage you to write letters to the editor. I had one printed a little while ago, and one of the other members of the committee did two weeks ago. You can only get a letter printed in LNG once a month or so, because they don't want the same person all the time. But anything we can do to put that pressure on the legislature is what we're trying to do. So what?
Or two. You could send one to Scott Martin and one to your local rep, whoever that is, and that would be terrific. They're here, and continue that. This sheet has the name and address of all the representatives in Lancaster County and what I consider to be good talking points. And then this is just an information. This is basically what I just said. So if you'd like any of that, please get it. Oh, plus, I keep forgetting to do this. So if you're interested in being on our mailing list, you can sign this. So, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate so many of you staying. This has been really wonderful. And I am very grateful for everything you do for the children at Ross. I know